The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents God Doesn't Send You to Hell, You Do. So, on a recent episode of the Atheist Experience, there was a caller who called in to suggest that God doesn't send you to hell, you send yourself to hell. And you can go to the episode, it's a late January episode, and actually watch that. I'm not going to rehash all of that. But it prompted a discussion that took place after the show was over. And I was very unhappy with what I did during that discussion. And I know the reasons for it. Some of them are going to sound like excuses, but I want to put it out there because maybe not only can I learn from how I did it wrong, but maybe other people can learn from how I did it wrong as well. So there was a young man who had shown up in a suit and tie, came with a buddy of his after church, and he heard that caller talking about God doesn't send you to hell, you send yourself to hell. And he wanted to call into the show and correct me. So he called from the studio audience, and when I finally got to the point near the end of the show where I was going to take his call, he was still sitting there having assumed that I wasn't going to get to him. And so he tried to run outside to take the call, but by then I'd already hung up. And when he came back in the room, you'll see part of it in maybe the after show stuff. I said, hey, don't worry about it. We're going to sit out there and eat dinner, and you can address the topic then. And he did. Now, I'll start with the excuses and why they don't count. I have type 2 diabetes. I hadn't eaten. And when that happens, I'm prone to being grumpier. Doesn't matter. Not an excuse. That's what happens. So I was sitting there and I was eating my lasagna. And he said, hey, I wanted to challenge your claim on whether you send yourself to hell or God sends you to hell. And he thought he came up with a really good example that would show how I was wrong. Unfortunately, his example was bad, and he wouldn't recognize this. And so I'm going to paraphrase the conversation. I will say that it ended with me getting up, yelling, and leaving. That's the part that I'm not particularly proud of. So what was his counter to my response? He started with, well, you have particular rules, Matt, about when you're going to hang up on a caller. And we'll go ahead and presume that the callers are familiar with these rules. And so if someone calls in and they have been made aware that if they say certain things or do certain things, that you're just going to hang up on them. When that happens and you hang up on them, couldn't you just say they did that to themselves? No. I still hung up on them. I'm the one who took the action that resulted in them hanging up. And I tried to point out that, first of all, they took an action with an expected consequence. We'll go ahead and assume that they knew what the rules are, even though my rules aren't hard and fast. But ultimately, I decide whether or not I'm going to hang up on somebody. I don't always get it right. I'm not justifying, sometimes I think I go too long, sometimes I'm too short. Mistakes are going to be made. I'm not perfect. I'm not going to beat myself up too much over that. But we're constantly trying to improve. But let's assume that they knew what my rules were. They have the ability to call and talk to me or email and talk to me at any time to discuss whether or not they think it was fair for me, or whether or not my rules are what they should be, whether or not they were unjustly hung up upon. But at the end of the day, if I don't want them to be hung up on, then I don't hang up on them. And this was something that came in during that call on the show, which was, God doesn't want me to go to hell. I'm choosing to go to hell by not doing what God wants, or however they want to do it. But at the end of the day, if God is the one who is ultimately deciding whether or not I go to hell, and I am the one who's ultimately deciding whether or not you're going to be hung up on, then it's my decision. And I can, if somebody breaks a rule, just say, no, I'm not going to hang up. I'm going to let this keep going. Problem solved. At no point has he demonstrated that, the truth of you send yourself to hell. I also pointed out that when it comes to the callers, they have access to me. And while the rules aren't written down somewhere, they could be. But if we're going to make the assumption that the callers know what the rules are, that doesn't apply to the God scenario, because I'm unaware of any God and I'm unaware of any rules from a God. And at that point, his Bible, which was placed on the table, got nicely padded, and it's all in here. Well, this unfortunately derails the entire rest of the conversation, because he never has to acknowledge that he's come up with a flawed rebuttal, which actually makes my point for me. Instead, now we're going to have a conversation about, okay, you say that that is God's rules, but I have no way of knowing that. Well, then that turns into a discussion about, well, there's so many prophecies that have been fulfilled in the Bible. And at this point, I'm already a little irritated that somebody came up with a simplistic and flawed analogy as a rebuttal. And when it didn't work and actually backfired, rather than acknowledging that, now we're on a discussion about prophecy and biblical prophecy. And I made a passing comment about how not every prophecy in the book is fulfilled, and he went off to try to Google that right away. But it didn't matter, because even if you had a book with 1,000 very specific prophecies, which had all come true except for one, and you were arguing that it was going to at some point in the future, even if I agreed that it was likely that that prediction would come true as well, you can't tell me how those prophecies or predictions came true. You cannot say, oh, it's true because it's God. The book says this, 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 and this, and it also says the book is the Word of God, so therefore that must be true as well. That's not true. I can list 10 things, and 8 of them can be true, and the other 2 can be completely false. You know, it's trivially easy to do. I've done it. Other people have done it. Eric Murphy's done it with the Book of Eric thing on Talk Heathen. That, of course, went into a conversation about how, you know, you don't get to, well, what is the foundation of morality? And that book advocates things that you and I would both say are immoral, like slavery, like forcing a rapist to marry his rape victim. The discussion there became rather gross and heated. Because, so first of all, I'm not sorry to say this, he was a smug little passive-aggressive shit. And so as he saw that his failure to acknowledge any point, his failure to present any sort of argument or evidence or a sufficient rebuttal was clearly irritating me as I was still trying to finish my food, he decided that he would play the game that some people do, the passive-aggressive game of, I'm just going to sit here and remain super extra calm, like extra calm and extra rigid. But I'm going to like roll my eyes or make a little look with my face, but I'm never going to raise my voice. And in the eyes of all the people around us, if you raise your voice and I don't, I win. Well, that shit might have worked if we were in his church, but we were at the Atheist Community of Austin, so it's not like he's going to convince anybody who's actually listening. This is the part that I was mad at myself about, because I allowed myself to get irritated and raise my voice when there was probably a better way of dealing with it. But it is exhausting to sit through the show. Yeah, hey, here's another excuse. It's exhausting to sit through the show and then try and have a conversation with someone who will not acknowledge any points, doesn't understand the subjects, interrupts, and then makes declarations about what's in my head. Because I was talking about, hey, is it immoral to own another person's property? And his answer, unless God says so. It's immoral to force a rapist to marry his rape victim, unless God says so. And so now everything is what God says, or what this book says is the truth. And there were other people there who were trying to have a conversation, and this is also difficult because I was building towards a point, trying to get him to acknowledge something, and other people are chiming in, deflecting the conversation in different ways. So there's a couple of good lessons to learn from this, but in some of the deflections, Shane had said, you know, what if you found a book where more prophecies had come true? Would you believe that book and that God instead of the one you're advocating? And his answer was, well, yes, but I don't believe that that would actually happen because God would not allow that. And you know, we were pointing, basically, you've decided that this book is the true one and only Word of God, and now anything that anybody proposes either can't happen, isn't true, or you just ignore it. And you don't want to, these things that make it appear that God is immoral, That's just human failings. Whatever God says is moral. Whatever this book says is moral. And that's a frustrating thing, which is why I ended the conversation. I have no interest in someone who just says, I believe this book, and that's all there is to it. And no matter what's in here, if you say that something in this book's immoral, no, it's not, because God permitted it. If you say something in this book isn't true, you've misunderstood it. If you want to talk about your own moral system, which I did, he asked me about it. I started to answer. I was halfway, partially through an explanation. And then he said that, well, you're just talking about situational ethics, and that means there is a situation under which you would say that it would be okay to own people as property. No, there's not. Oh, there is a situation where you would say it's okay to force a rapist to marry his rape victim. No, there's not. You misunderstand situational ethics. The fact that we determine the morality, the ethical valuation of a particular scenario based on the surrounding circumstances does not mean that there is a set of circumstances under which it would definitely be viewed as moral. You can come up with outlandish fictional accounts, but each one of them suffers from a flaw. If we're talking about owning another person's property, what some people will do is say, oh, well, what if they consent? Okay, well, that's not the same thing. Because when we talk about owning someone's property, this is a violation of their bodily autonomy and sovereignty. Oh, well, what if the alternative is like, I'm going to shoot you in the head? Okay, then the right thing for that person to do, if they value their life, is to go ahead and acquiesce and then find a way to escape. This isn't an argument for slavery. It's not an argument for owning people's property. But he interrupted and he was like, oh, no, here, according to you, there would be a scenario where this is moral. And that's when I lost it. No, stop pretending that you can read my mind. The fact that you judge something based on the situation does not mean there is a situation for any given scenario where it would be viewed as moral. Meanwhile, even if there were, those aren't, even if it were the case for a specific scenario that you could contrive a situation where it would be viewed as moral, doesn't mean that that applies to the norm or the standard, or that that scenario is even plausible or likely within reality. It's playing around with something that we both understood to be correct. And he's basically saying, yeah, it would be wrong to own people under any other circumstances except when God says it's okay. And then that trumps all. So I got irritated and left. The things to note. First of all, make sure you're in the right headspace to actually have a conversation. I wasn't. I was, exhausted, hungry, irritable. If you're going to engage in a conversation, it needs to either be one-on-one or everybody needs to know when and how to participate and stay on the same page. Because those distractions get us moving to where this conversation, which started about does God send you to hell or do you send yourself to hell, went to prophecy for about 15 seconds, morality for about a minute. I mean, this whole thing was maybe 5-10 minutes tops. It bounced all over because different people wanted to chime in and because the person I was talking to didn't want to argue or would not argue in a fair and reasonable manner. Would not acknowledge, oh, that point that I made was bad. So, I presented a case, you presented your rebuttal, I explained why your rebuttal's wrong, and it never gets acknowledged, we just move on to something else. Sometimes it's better to not have the conversation. If I ever see this person again, I'm sure I could sit down and have a nice, calm discussion with them that focused on a particular event. The problem is that may never happen now because in his mind, he won. He riled up, the atheist, and the only reason anybody would ever lose their temper is because they know they're wrong or they know they're losing. This is the lie that gets into people's heads. Hey, if you were confident in your belief and you were actually being reasonable, there would be no reason for you to get upset. Well, that's not true. There are many times good reasons to get upset. A particularly good reason to get upset is when someone is arguing for something that you both understand is immoral, and they're just giving an excuse for it. And they set up a particular brick wall, the Holy Bible, to say, hey, this is the foundation. Nothing you say is going to change that. Any objection you raise, I can just blow off and ignore because it's in the book. Well, if God doesn't want to send people to hell, then the people who go to hell, no, that's nobody, by the way. I don't believe that there is a hell or anybody going there, are either sending themselves there, which means they might be more powerful than God, because if God doesn't want you to go to hell, but you say, I'm going anyway, and God doesn't do anything to stop you, can you really say that God doesn't want you to go to hell? Because if I was God and I didn't want somebody to go to hell, I'd prevent it. Oh, well, I'm allowing what they want to trump what I want. Cool, that's fine. But if I make the rules for who goes to hell, and I have the option to suspend those rules, and I have done nothing to make sure that somebody understands these in fact are the rules, the only people I've heard about God's rules, about God's rules are people. I haven't heard from a God, got no way to talk with a God, so far as I know. God, where are you? Why don't you show up right now, explain what your rules are, then we can have a discussion, and we can figure out whether or not your rules are just. And if at the end of the day you don't agree with me that your rules are unjust, or silly, or undeserving of respect, you can still squash me like a bug, but that is might makes right. That is not morality, it's not ethics, it's nothing more than, my way or the highway. Okay, I'll take the highway. We'll see you next time.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.